Imagine standing in a crowded square, the stench of blood still lingering in the air, while a man in black calmly prepares his tools. He isn't a wild butcher, nor a lawless killer. He is an official servant of justice, a man paid and trained by the city itself. His name was Frantz Schmidt, and for more than 4 decades he reigned as one of the most infamous executioners in European history. The people called him Master Frantz, a title of respect and fear, but behind that name was a man who sent almost 400 souls to their deaths in ways so brutal that even hardened criminals trembled at the mere whisper of his presence. Born in 1555, Frantz Schmidt did not choose this life. His father had once been forced into the role of executioner by a cruel noble, and in those days, execution was not an honorable profession. It was considered dirty, cursed work. The hangman's family was shunned, forced to live on the edge of society, treated as unclean. For Frantz, the path was set before he could even understand it. He would inherit the blade, the rope, the fire, and the iron, and with them, he would inherit a legacy of blood. But Schmidt was different from other executioners of his time. He was not drunk, sloppy, or careless. He was precise, almost surgical. He kept detailed records of every execution he performed. Each name, each crime, each method, carefully written down in his journal. That journal survives to this day, and through its pages we see not only the cold statistics of death, but the terrifying imagination of a man who turned punishment into spectacle. When Frantz Schmidt stepped into the execution yard, the crowd surged forward, eager to see the condemned's final moments. The accused would kneel, trembling, perhaps begging for mercy, and Schmidt, dressed in black, would remain calm, his face cold and unreadable. With a swift strike of his sword, he could sever a man's head clean in a single blow. But not all deaths came so quickly. Some were slow, agonizing performances that lasted hours, even days. One of his earliest recorded executions was the breaking wheel, a punishment reserved for the most despised criminals. The condemned was tied to a massive wooden wheel, arms and legs stretched wide. Then, with an iron hammer, Schmidt shattered each bone one by one. The sound of cracking echoed across the square as the victims screamed, their body twisted into unnatural shapes, their limbs dangling like broken branches. When the suffering became unbearable, Schmidt would deliver the final blow, crushing the skull to release the soul. But until then, the crowd feasted on the pain, watching every twitch, every howl of agony. Schmidt was a master of variety. Hanging, beheading, burning, drowning, even mutilation. Each punishment was carefully chosen to fit the crime. Thieves might lose a hand before facing the rope. Murderers could expect the sword. Heretics and witches were fed to the flames. And traitors, those despised most of all, were torn apart limb by limb, their remains left on display as a warning. For Frantz Schmidt, execution was not simply death. It was theater, and he was both director and star performer. But what made Schmidt's reign so chilling was not just the blood he spilled. It was the coldness with which he carried out his duty. He was not cruel for the sake of cruelty. He did not rant, he did not gloat. He worked with calm precision, almost like a doctor performing surgery. And in fact, in his later years, Schmidt became exactly that. A respected healer who treated hundreds of patients with skill and compassion. A man who spent his mornings tending the sick and his afternoons tearing men apart in the square. The paradox of his life is as haunting as the executions themselves. How could a man who crushed skulls and burned bodies also soothe the sick and heal the wounded? Was he a monster, or was he simply a man trapped by fate, forced to play the role that society had given him? This contradiction makes Frantz Schmidt not just the bloodiest executioner of his time, but one of the most unsettling figures in history. and his story has only just begun. As the years passed, Frantz Schmidt's reputation only grew darker. He was no ordinary hangman. He brought efficiency, precision, and imagination to the art of killing. The people of Nuremberg knew that when a criminal was condemned, Schmidt would be there, standing tall, sword in hand, ready to deliver justice in a way no one would ever forget. His journal records execution after execution, a grim catalogue of human suffering. Nearly 400 deaths carried out under his hand, each one personal, each one remembered. Some criminals met swift ends, their heads rolling cleanly into the straw with a single strike of Schmidt's razor-sharp sword. But others were chosen for pain, for terror, for spectacle. Take the case of a murderer condemned to the wheel. The crowd gathered early, pressing close, children hoisted on shoulders, vendors selling bread and beer. They knew this would not be quick. Schmidt stood before the condemned man, his iron club gleaming in the morning sun. The man screamed for mercy, his voice cracking with terror. It didn't matter. He was tied down to the wheel, limbs spread wide like a sacrifice. Then came the blows. First, the legs, smashed at the knees until they bent the wrong way, bones bursting through the skin. The man howled, his voice echoing across the square. Then the arms, shattered at the elbows, twisted and broken like torn branches. The crowd roared with each crack, each spray of blood. By the time Schmidt delivered the final skull-crushing strike, the man's body was no longer human. It was a mangled heap of broken limbs, left to rot as crows circled above. But that was only one of many horrors. Another condemned was burned alive, his crime heresy. For that, fire was the chosen tool. Schmidt bound him to the stake with heavy chains, wood piled high at his feet. The man pleaded, his eyes wide, tears streaming down his cheeks. But Schmidt's face remained calm, unreadable. The torch touched the kindling, and within moments flames surged upward, licking the victim's legs, climbing higher, devouring flesh. The smell of burning skin filled the air. The man's screams grew shrill, his voice breaking, until his body convulsed and collapsed into the flames. The crowd watched in silence, transfixed by the sight of a human being reduced to ash. Not every punishment ended in death. Some criminals were maimed, scarred for life, their bodies left as living reminders of their crimes. Thieves often had their ears cut off, or their hands chopped away. One man, a repeat offender, begged for mercy as Schmidt held his wrist to the block. With one clean strike, the sword came down, severing hand from arm, blood spraying into the dirt. The man shrieked. Clutching the stump as Schmidt raised the severed hand high for all to see. It was not just punishment. It was humiliation. A public branding that marked the man forever as a criminal. And yet, through all of this, Schmidt remained disturbingly calm. He did not revel in cruelty, nor did he hesitate. To him it was duty. He was the hand of the law, the bringer of justice. His precision, his lack of emotion, made the violence even more terrifying. There are stories of Schmidt's beheading so clean, so swift, that the head seemed to blink afterward, eyes fluttering in shock before lifelessly staring out into the crowd. Some said he could decapitate a man in a single strike, even as the condemned knelt trembling, unable to hold still. His sword never wavered, never faltered. He was as precise as a surgeon, except his patients never survived. But the true horror lies in the sheer variety of punishments he oversaw. He flogged women accused of adultery until their backs were raw and dripping blood. He hanged young men for theft, their bodies jerking and twitching as the noose strangled them slowly, turning their faces purple as their tongues lolled out. He drowned criminals in the river, tying stones around their necks before watching them sink into the dark waters, bubbles rising as the crowd peered over the edge. And perhaps most disturbing of all, Schmidt kept careful records of it all. Not as confessions of guilt or expressions of remorse, but as cold, methodical notes. His journals are not stories of a sadist. They are the logs of a professional. A man who believed his work was righteous, necessary, even honorable. And that is what makes it so chilling. Because to the condemned, Frantz Schmidt was no man of honor. He was a shadow of death, a living nightmare. Imagine standing before him, the crowd howling, the instruments of death gleaming in the light. Imagine knowing that this man, calm, steady, unreadable, would decide exactly how much pain you felt before your soul left your body. For decades, he was the last face hundreds ever saw. And he never stopped. Year after year, blood after blood, until his name became legend. A name whispered with fear. A name written in blood. The blood never stopped. By the mid-point of his career, Frantz Schmidt had become a master of execution, feared in every corner of Nuremberg and beyond. His sword had tasted the necks of nobles, thieves, murderers, witches, and deserters. His iron club had shattered bones. His ropes had strangled. His flames had consumed. For Schmidt, there was no crime too small, no sinner beyond his reach. One of the most terrifying stories in his journals tells of a woman accused of poisoning her husband. Poison was a crime seen as cowardly, hidden, and therefore deserving of an especially cruel punishment. The court sentenced her to be boiled alive. Schmidt himself prepared the cauldron, filling it with water, then setting the fire beneath. The crowd pressed close, the anticipation thick in the air. When the woman was dragged forward, bound and screaming, Schmidt forced her into the bubbling water. Her skin blistered instantly, the smell of cooking flesh sickening the onlookers. She thrashed and shrieked. Her face contorted in pure agony until her body went limp, floating in the boiling froth. The crowd gasped, some retching, but Schmidt simply noted it in his journal that night with the same detached tone as always. Boiled the poisoner. Execution successful. Another tale tells of a robber sentenced to death by the wheel. This one Schmidt drew out deliberately. He crushed the man's legs, then left him on the wheel for hours, alive but broken, the sun baking his bloodied body while flies swarmed his wounds. Passers-by could hear his weak cries, echoing from the square until night fell, when death finally claimed him. To the people, this wasn't just punishment. It was theater. And Schmidt was the master of ceremonies. But not all of his victims were hardened criminals. Some were children. His journals record the hanging of a young boy no older than 15, caught stealing bread. The boy sobbed, his body trembling as Schmidt placed the rope around his neck. The crowd watched as his thin frame dangled in the air, kicking helplessly, eyes bulging, tongue protruding as life was squeezed from him. For a moment, the crowd was silent. Even hardened onlookers were shaken by the sight of a child dying in front of them. But Schmidt, he simply did his job. The law demanded blood, and he delivered it. And still, there was more. Witchcraft was an accusation that swept across Europe like wildfire, and Schmidt found himself at the center of these trials. Women, often midwives, widows, or those who simply lived alone, were accused of consorting with the devil. The punishment was death by fire. Schmidt tied them to stakes, their hair matted with sweat and tears, as priests shouted prayers and the torches were lit. The women's screams were described as inhuman, though Schmidt recorded them without passion, as though describing the slaughter of livestock. To him, the screams were just part of the job. The more blood he spilled, the colder he became. But here's the paradox. While he was a master of death, Schmidt was also a healer. By night, after executions, he would return home and tend to the sick. He set broken bones, treated wounds, and mixed herbal remedies. Hundreds came to him for care, trusting the same hands that had severed heads and crushed skulls to bring them relief. And he did. His patients lived. His journals are filled not only with accounts of executions, but of cures and treatments. To many, he was a savior. Imagine that contradiction. In the morning, a man begging Schmidt not to drop the blade, and in the evening, a woman thanking him for saving her child's life. Executioner and physician, killer and healer, saint and butcher, all in one. Perhaps the most infamous execution of his career was the death of a murderer named Hans. The man had killed a family in cold blood, and the city demanded spectacle. Schmidt was ready. Hans was sentenced to be broken alive, and Schmidt took the task personally. Blow after blow, he shattered the man's bones, leaving him writhing on the wheel. But instead of finishing him, Schmidt left him alive, propped up for the crowd to watch. For 3 days, Hans hung there, still breathing, his body a twisted wreck, until death finally released him. Schmidt recorded the execution with chilling precision, noting exactly how many hours the man lasted and how many times he cried out for mercy. By now, Schmidt's name carried weight far beyond Nuremberg. Criminals whispered it in fear, townspeople spoke it in awe. Parents threatened their children with the warning, "Behave, or Schmidt will get you." He wasn't just an executioner. He was a legend of blood. And yet, through all of this, he believed he was a man of honor. His father had been forced into the role of executioner, branded with shame, treated as untouchable. But Schmidt, through his meticulous work and service, sought to restore dignity to the position. He saw himself not as a monster, but as an instrument of justice. To him, the executions were not acts of cruelty, but necessary duties that maintained order. But the condemned didn't see justice. They saw death. They saw the steel of his sword, the iron of his wheel, the fire of his torches, and they screamed as the crowd cheered and the executioner's cold eyes never wavered. For 45 years, Frantz Schmidt killed 400 souls, each one recorded in his hand, each one remembered. And while his patients praised him as a healer, the condemned cursed him as a butcher. His life was a contradiction carved in blood. And when he finally retired, he left behind not only the bodies, but the words, his journal, a record of brutality and justice, cruelty and honor, death and healing, a window into the darkest corners of human history. Frantz Schmidt's reign of death stretched over 4 decades. By the time he laid down his sword for the last time, he had executed 394 people and flogged, branded, or mutilated thousands more. Every life he ended, every bone he broke, every scream he heard, he carried them all into old age. And yet, he lived not as a broken man, but as one who believed he had done righteous work. In his journals, Schmidt reflected on his career with a strange serenity. He wrote of his executions with the same tone a farmer might use to record his harvest. There was no poetry in his words, no remorse, no horror, only precision. Beheaded Hans the thief with 1 blow. Execution clean. Burned Anna for witchcraft. She confessed. Hanged 3 murderers at dawn. No incident. His detachment makes the blood drip even colder from the page. But outside the execution yard, Schmidt built a second life. He became a respected healer, a man to whom the sick and injured turned for help. In a time when physicians were rare and expensive, Schmidt offered care to the poor. He treated wounds, set bones, delivered babies, and prepared medicines. Hundreds of people owed their lives to him. To them, Schmidt was not a butcher. He was a savior. The same hands that had severed necks stitched wounds. The same eyes that watched men burn with fire watched fevers break in children. This contradiction haunts his story. Was he a monster, or was he a servant of justice? Was he a demon, or a necessary hand of order in a world drowning in crime. To the families of the condemned, Schmidt was the face of terror. To the families of his patients, he was the face of mercy. To history, he is both. And perhaps that is what makes him the bloodiest executioner of all. He did not kill for pleasure. He did not torture for personal joy. He killed because it was his duty. He killed because the law demanded it. He killed because someone had to. And he believed he did it well. When he retired in 1617, Schmidt petitioned the emperor himself to clear his family name of the disgrace tied to the executioner's profession. Remarkably, he succeeded. His children were free from the stain of shame that had haunted his father. And Schmidt, the man who had ended more lives than any executioner of his age, spent his final years as a respected citizen, living in peace until his death in 1634. But the peace he felt does not erase the rivers of blood he spilled. 400 souls. Men, women, children. Murderers, thieves, witches, beggars. Their screams echo through history, their last moments etch forever in his journal. And so, centuries later, we remember him not as a healer, not as a father, not as a man who fought to restore dignity to a despised profession. We remember him as what he truly was, the bloodiest executioner in history. A man who perfected the art of death. A man whose cold hands shaped both life and death. A man whose shadow still hangs over the gallows of Europe, whispering to us across the ages. Because if Frantz Schmidt teaches us anything, it is this: cruelty does not always wear the face of madness. Sometimes, cruelty wears the mask of duty. Sometimes, the greatest horrors are not done by monsters, but by men who believe they are doing what is right. And that is what makes his story so terrifying.